1, thinking particularly of the 20th verse, according to my earnest expectation and my hope, that in nothing that I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now Christ shall be magnified in my body. I used to think that in the second letter to the of Corinthians and chapter 5, well, Paul gives us a kind of summary there of his theology. He believes that if we're absent from the body, we're present with the Lord. Knowing the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. We must all appear at the judgment seat of Christ. And then verse 14, I've always considered, was the thing that really motivated him. He out-preached everybody, he out-suffered everybody, he out-prayed everybody. I thought that 14th verse, the love of Christ constraineth me, was his main motivation. Along again with the obligation to present Christ in all his majesty, all his glory, to remind us, as dear Keith said one day in my office, we were talking about the roads. He said, well, all roads lead to the judgment seat, which is true, they do. Whether a Democrat, an autocrat, a plutocrat, or any other crat, or a liberal, or what you are. Whether we're slaves or free men, intellectuals or ignoramuses, black or white, rich or poor, all roads lead to the judgment seat, without exception. Now, I've come to this conclusion, reading recently in Philippians here, that the motivation of the apostle in his zigzag course, not up and down spiritually, but zigzag in prison, out of prison, in weariness, in fastings, in painfulness, in tribulation, in distress, in perils of his countrymen, in perils of the deep, in perils of robbers, whatever it was, the one thing that motivated him, I believe, is in this 20th verse. As now always, Christ shall be magnified in my body. Or some put it by my body, whether it be by life or by death. The thing that gripped me as I read it this week, Christ may be magnified not in my ministry, not in my miracles, not in my super love. I outlove everybody else in the world today. I outpreach them. I outsuffer everybody. But he says that Christ may be magnified in my body. If you turn over to the, where is it, chapter 4, verse 8. This explains his life, I think. He says, be careful for nothing, be prayerful in everything, and be thankful for anything. That covers a lot of territory, doesn't it? The King James Version, of course, the best one, says, be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and thanksgiving, prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto the Lord. I believe that's a territory in which he lived and moved and had his being. No, this epistle is very beautiful. Do you know why? Because it's a love letter. Some of you ladies remember the first one you got. I guess it's stuffed away somewhere now. Tied up with a ribbon maybe. Or you threw it in the garbage as soon as you read it. I don't know, but anyhow. Love letters are beautiful. A fellow in our church fell in love with my sister. He wrote a letter to her. Boy, Shakespeare couldn't have done better. He saw everything. She'd eyes like stars and her cheeks were rosy and she was this. I never knew. I'd lived with her 20 years and never noticed one of the things he said she had. Because beauty, again, is in the eye of the beholder. This is a lovely epistle. For one thing, there's no mention of sin in this epistle at all. I think what Paul is actually saying here, that in the greatest suffering you can have the greatest joy. We like the bonuses, we're not too anxious to have the burdens, are we? If you read the epistle carefully, you'll find that 14 times he mentions joy. And he's in a stinking hall of a prison we wouldn't put a dog in these days. No bed in it, no creature comforts, the rottenest food. Just a hellhole. And yet here he is sending a letter of greetings and cheering to other people who should be writing letters to him. So with all the greatness and all the pressure, he says it's possible to have this boundless joy. Again, he does not mention sin, he mentions flesh once and then dismisses it. He's showing us that there's a grace of God far more exceeding abundantly above all that we can either ask or think. The great old Scottish saint, Samuel Rutherford, some of you know that great hymn, The Sands of Time Are Sinking. He didn't write it. Mrs. Cousins extracted phrases out of his wonderful diary and put that marvellous, marvellous hymn together. I think it's maybe the greatest hymn ever written. But he says, I have to go into the king's cellar to find the king's wine. I remember old houses not far from where we live. We got in one day. The owner's son was a friend of mine. He said, ever been in our huge underground cellar? I said, no. We went in and there were all the old wine racks. We searched dozens. They were all empty. It's a blessing they were. I'm sure I'd have got drunk that day. I was so thirsty in that old basement. But he said, look at the old wines they used to keep. Labels, you know, from Portugal and Spain and here and there, and champagne from France and all the rest of it. But they're not stored upstairs in the refrigerator. They're stored, or were stored, in dungeons, in the dark places. And we would like God to serve up, as it were, the wine of heaven, just while we're living on the level, without any interruption of trial or tribulation or testing. But that's not the way that God works. Let me look over here a minute. I've lost my marker here. Let me see. I'll find it. Well, oh, you can be looking right now at well, you know it anyhow. You know Romans chapter 12. I'm thinking of places where Paul talks about his body. He doesn't talk about yielding your mind merely. He says in Romans 12, 1 and 2, I beseech you, brethren, therefore, by the mercies of God, that ye present your body a living sacrifice. Not your brain, not your emotion, not your spirit. But if I said to somebody, look, here's my watch, well, it's a fairly modern one, you know, it doesn't have a battery. I don't have to wind it up. The old one, they had works in, you know, they were marvellous old things. They used to call them stem winders. They're collector's items now. If I gave a man my watch, I gave him the works, I gave him the hands, I gave him the face, I gave him everything. Well, if I present my body a living sacrifice, surely I'm presenting everything that I have. My spirit, my soul and my body, for which Paul prays, you remember, when he's speaking to the Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians 5:23, he prays, the very God of peace sanctify you wholly, and I pray that your spirit and soul and body be preserved blameless unto the coming of the Lord. Faithful is he that calleth you, who also will do it. So I give my body in its entirety to God. A girl not very well known in England years ago wrote a beautiful hymn. All for Jesus, all for Jesus. All my being's ransomed powers, all my thoughts and